Good evening. This is the Legislative Affairs Committee of the Revere City Council for December 3rd, 2018. Madam Clerk?
Roll call of the members of the subcommittee. Councilor McKenna?
Here.
Here. Councilor Morabito is absent. Councilor Patch?
Here.
Here. Councilor Powers is absent. And Chairman Zambudo?
Here.
Here. Quorum is present. First item on the agenda is Council Order 18-011, an ordinance relative to abandoned bicycles.
Ms. DeMora.
Julie DeMauro, Healthy Community Initiatives Office. Just so you know that the ordinance that is presented there, I've actually sent it out to all of the bike companies and told them that this is our ordinance that will be voted on. So as of right now, we have not had a lot of issues, but I think having this in place is going to help us further along down the line, especially with some of the bike companies wanting to bring in e-bikes and scooters, and that prohibits those until we have a better handle on it. That's it. Anyone have any questions?
Great. Members of the committee? Councilor McKenna, anything to add? Councilor Patch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Julie, I still got the problem with them leaving them everywhere on the sidewalk. It was the last few days, there was one on Washington Ave by the Stop and Shop. I mean, just laid out on the sidewalk. There's got to be a quicker way to correct this, I think. What do you wait 3 days, right? 3 days?
So as soon as we get a call from a constituent, that sets the clock going. So then after 24 hours, if the bike is still there, then we contact the company and they have 3 days to pick it up. As of December 15th, the bikes, just a point of reference for the winter, the bikes may be going away for the winter because the number of bikes that are out on the street versus the number of rides being taken daily has dropped significantly. We have about 30 bikes on the street. We only have maybe about 6 to 8 rides per day, and we have about 3 to 4 riders. So basically, whoever renting the bike is getting themselves to and from places. In terms of the bikes being laid out on the ground, they can see where they are on the GPS, but they can't tell if the bikes are standing up or not standing. But we can ask them to cut the fleet back even more.
Okay, I just, no, I got no problem. I got no problem with it, but I just, I think it just shouldn't happen. For 3 days, I think is too long.
Okay.
But I mean, if you want to keep it the way, whatever, you're the boss.
Well, we just got to give them time to pick it up, and the 3 days is to build in for those holiday weekends where they don't really work on a Monday, so we want to be able to give them that extra day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, I think I'm ready to take a vote of the committee.
On the ordinance relative to abandoned bicycles, Councilor McKenna?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Morabito is absent. Councilor Patch?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Powers is absent. And Chairman Zambudo?
Yes.
Yes, the ordinance will be forwarded to the full City Council with a favorable recommendation.
Thank you.
Next item on the Legislative Affairs Subcommittee agenda is an ordinance relative to snow, slush, and ice on sidewalks.
Okay, committee members, I'm sure everybody has received a final edited package of this ordinance, and it appears the Mayor's Chief of Staff is here to answer any questions. So, Councilor McKenna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we just added on this snow and slush and ice removal, we just added discharging from sun pumps. And we also removed tenants and managers from the ordinance to owner. And that's what we did. If Mr. Mara wants to come up and talk about it, that'd be great.
Thank you, Councilor. If anybody has any questions, essentially, after Joanne and Councilor McKenna and I met and discussed this, we worked out a few wrinkles that were in the original ordinance. Most important probably was removing as Councilman McKenna said, removing the reference to tenants or managers of property, and by vesting the responsibility for snow removal, slush removal, ice remediation, strictly in the owner of property, it will allow inspectional services to bring the enforcement of the ordinance under the ambit of Chapter 40U. So, because Chapter 40U only recognizes responsibility in owners, not in residents of the property. If an owner, and we've specifically written into the ordinance that the responsibility under the ordinance cannot be delegated by lease, or the civic responsibility cannot be delegated by lease or other agreement. So if a property owner makes an agreement with their tenant, that's fine. If the tenant doesn't do what he's supposed to do, we're still ticketing the property, potentially ticketing the property, and it's the owner that's responsible, and then the issue is between owner and tenant with response, with who's actually going to pay for it. The other addition that we made, as Councilman McKenna brought out, was the specific reference to sump pumps. When you consider what a sump pump does, it doesn't create an immediate hazard, it just makes the sidewalk wet or creates a puddle. So what the problem that happens is when it freezes. So the ordinance, with the section of the ordinance that specifically refers to sump pumps, suggests the owner's remediation of the problem. And there may be certain ways to do that. They could perhaps redirect the flow of where a sump pump discharges. In some cases, we understand, and we discussed this with City Engineer Nick Rystrom, there are some properties where really that isn't an option. You'd simply be pumping into somebody else's yard. So what the ordinance requires is that when there's a formation of ice as a result of liquid that has been discharged into the public way, and we included in that discharge not only pumps, but also runoff from sloping roofs, runoff just out of yards. When there's a hazard, a public safety hazard that is formed as a result of that, as a result of the formation, the sump pump causes the puddle, the ice causes the formation of ice, the owner of the responsibility is required to take some remediation efforts, whether it's to remove the ice, and where that is, as we know, sometimes impossible, cover it with salt or sand or some de-icer that will make it less slippery. So really, it's putting, the ultimate objective is to put the onus on owners of property to at least make sure that in front of their property, the area is passable at some time after a storm. Part of this ordinance that I did not play around with, and I think we talked about just to see what this body decided to do, was the amount of time that you permitted an owner to take these remediation efforts. The ordinance, when we first started playing with it, had 3 hours. Some of the research that I did suggested that other cities and towns were giving a little bit more time than that, as much as 24 hours. So that's up to you. I mean,
I don't think we can ask anybody to be, held to this unless you give them 24 hours. I mean, I don't think it's realistic. I'd like to say 4 hours. You got to have but that's not realistic. I mean, realistically, if you demand 24 hours, now you've given them enough time to get it done.
I tend to agree with you, Councilor, but that's completely within the discretion of this body.
Yeah.
Yes,
Councilor McKim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've had a number, and this is why it came up, this discharge from the sump pump pipes. I've had a number of calls from people. The thing is that a lot of these people can bury them or put them in a different spot than coming out on the street. So I want this body tonight to find out how long do we give these people to move their pipes, if there is an alternative for these people to move their pipes. If, like Mr. Morris said, if they can't move the pipes and the pipes are discharging on the sidewalk, then they have to cover it. You give them 24 hours to cover it with sand or try to remove it. But most of the pipes that I've seen, they could be replaced, repositioned in another place. They don't have to come out on the streets and the sidewalks. So how long do we give these people? Do we cite them? We give them like a notice and say, you have 5 days or 3 days or whatever it is, and that might be difficult in the wintertime if there's snow there. But, we have to put that, and I think in the ordinance too, that we give a certain amount of time. We give them a warning first, and then after 5 days, we cite them, or after 10 days, we cite them for not moving the pipe.
Yeah, compounding that
Thank
problem historically is that the city did, several years ago, undertake that amnesty program regarding sump pumps, and people who responded, the city's at the city's dime, the city then, where a storm drain was accessible, the city went in. What they were looking for were sump pumps that were tied directly into the sewage system, and which of course got the city in trouble. So what the city offered to do with everybody that had a sump pump was that the city would then first inspect it to see whether it was tied into a sewer line. If it were tied into a sewer line, it would then be corrected and so that it would discharge into the storm drain. Some people simply ignored the amnesty altogether. And those who did, I think maybe among those, and I say this based on speculation, but I think many who ignored the city's plea to have the inspections done by the city's contractor, I think those might be the people whose storm drains continue to just discharge aimlessly out into the street. I'm not positive about this, but I think that the engineering department actually has a data sheet of compliant properties where the properties that were inspected and then remediation efforts were either suggested or actually implemented. So, and that's where you do, like Engineer Rystrom explained, that you do have circumstances where there is no storm drain to discharge into, and that's why it's going out into the sidewalk and street. So we tried to modify the ordinance so that at least in those situations, if they take some remedial efforts, they're not going to be in violation.
I'd like to know how many of these we created ourselves, because I guarantee you that a lot of these sump pumps that we took out of the sewer system were unable to be put into a storm drain, and we're probably discharging them into the street. I would bet on that, but because it's impossible to put them all into a storm drain. It's just not physically possible. However, what's that? Oh, okay. But so I guess what I'm saying is I want to be careful about how much pressure we put on people that are at least discharging properly. It may be creating an ice problem in the winter, but they're not draining into our sewer system, which is a plus. So I want to be careful about this, is all I'm saying.
On that point, Councilor Zambuto, that's exactly what the councilors and I had discussed. The acknowledgement that in some cases, those storm drains are, going out onto the public way as a result of having been disconnected from the sewage system. But all this ordinance requires people to do in those situations is to, and this ordinance is written so that it applies both to ice that forms naturally and ice that forms as a result of manual manipulation, a pump or something. And all we're asking them to do is to take remedial efforts. If you can't remove the ice, then at least you can put some salt out or some, and the problem that Councilor McKenna referred to, and I think we all see it, is water that just discharges out. It's a sheet of ice. It hasn't snowed or rained for 3 days, and there's a skating rink in front of someone's house. You're simply asking that property owner to take remedial efforts to make the place safe, not only for the public, but for themselves.
Then
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bob, a lot of these, like on my ward, there's streets that don't have any drains. They were just, unfortunately, that's part of the problem why we have a problem, is contractors didn't do it right when they were building the houses. But now, the people that that took the chance to have the city put the sub pump out of the storage pipe, and CDM Smith, they went down and they changed it. But they just, now they put the pipes going into the street. So are we legally responsible for, now say you go in there and the neighbor doesn't want to put it in his backyard because there'll be a slush, it'll be wet and swampy, and that's the reason they probably told him to put it out in the street. And I know for a fact, I have one problem that legal, before we did the amnesty thing, got a permit, and they put it out into a street without drains, and constantly, the city's down there, sometimes they have to do with a backhoe. It gets so thick, the ice. I don't think going out there and throwing salt on it's gonna do anything on that. So I'm sure he ain't gonna like putting that pipe back into his backyard. I mean, that's how much water that comes out of his sump pump. So is the city responsible now that this was all set up by our city engineer? You know, I mean, he basically, in CDM Smith, they're responsible for doing this. So what's the legal?
Well, first of all, I don't wear the solicitor's hat, so this is speculation and discussion. In the ordinance, our ordinance doesn't really address that. But to the extent of legal responsibility in the city, I really wouldn't see the basis for that. It still remains the responsibility of a homeowner to take care of their own property, and what this ordinance does is to impose upon the homeowner the responsibility of at least making the way in front of their property safe. So in some cases, that may require, under this ordinance, shoveling at least a 36-inch path of snow so that people can orderly pass on the sidewalk. If there's ice in front of your property, this ordinance imposes on the property owner the responsibility to attempt to remove it or cover it. A suggestion in the ordinance is that the sump pump, or a pump in whatever type of pump it is, can be redirected to prevent that. But in some cases, it simply can't be. And what we were careful to do in this ordinance, at least we were careful to attempt to do, is to acknowledge that those circumstances do exist in some properties throughout the city, and make the duty or the act that we are requiring any of the following: redirection of the pump, or removal of the ice, or remediation of the ice. So it's a delicate situation because you can't address every single, you try to, but you do have circumstances, as you point out, that in some cases, because of the drains, the drain system, there's no place for the water to go. But it's like with anything else, it still remains a property owner's responsibility to maintain their property, and this is imposing some sort of civic duty to maintain the public way as well. Because ultimately what they are doing is creating a public hazard.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Councilor Novoselsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad this is being brought up, because I know over the last week and a half, I've filed 5 different complaints to ISD through 311 because of this drainage issue. And these 5 locations are being caused by owners, property owners. You know, they have retaining walls, and there's a 4-inch in one location on Florence Ave, 4-inch PVC pipe coming from their roof drain. I see it connected to it, underground, under their property, and it's shooting out waist high for people walking by. And on a rainy day, or even a day after the rainy day, as the water's running, it's pouring out there. And it's going on the sidewalk at Florence Ave, down Florence Ave, and across down to Centennial Ave. And last week, when it was frozen, there was ice that was like 6 inches thick, and cars were sliding all over the place. Thank God, you know, we got a salt barrel put in the corner, so if a case happens again. But that roof drain should not be allowed to drain out onto the sidewalk. And let me finish, and then you can respond to my different locations. Now, I don't know if that was approved by city. It's not a sump pump issue, it's a roof drain issue. That's one particular item. The other items are, you know, we have the sump pump issue coming out of the sewer. That was what you were talking about a little while ago, Bob. And then there's the sump pump issue that's just pumping out and down people's driveways, out onto the street. And then you have the roof drain issue, and then you have natural springs. Now, if people go up by Dunkin' Donuts on American Legion Highway, by John Mooney Road or Harris Street, there's water coming down there. I thought it was a leak or something. I called water department. It's natural water. There are springs in this city up in the top of the hills, and people have pumps in their homes just to pump it out from the top of a hill. Who would think that the people at the top of a hill need a pump to pump water out of their cellar? But anyway, so I've suggested to people to put in dry wells, you know, somewhere on their property. Those go down, you know, 8 to 10 feet with rock and stone, and it disperses the water naturally. Or a French drain, which doesn't go down to 10 feet, but it may go down 4 feet, and put stone in and the dirt over it. That takes the water and stops it from going out onto the street. Now, CDM Smith and I follow them very, very closely in my area. And I can tell you that I don't know of any location that they've pumped it out onto the street. They have found ways to run even 100 feet to a catch basin, to go on Hitchborn Street, Lower Hitchborn Street. They went 100 feet along the curb and put a drain in there for natural water to come out of a building, to be pumped out. So right now, there is nothing in the books that can penalize or stop anybody from pumping water out onto the street, except for the residuals of what happens after the fact. And I think we have to try and stop that as much as possible. And I think we have to stop the roof drains out onto public property, sump pumps of just natural water out onto public property. It has to stop. We have to stop it somewhere. I know it's going to cost people money, but it's better than having a dangerous situation and somebody get hurt. So, you know, I'm looking at this very closely. I don't know if we're going to make a decision on this tonight, but I think something has to be done. And making people cover in front of their property on the sidewalks is part of a good move. And we have to start somewhere, but.
Right, the ordinance is not going to address, it's not going to fix the problem.
Right.
But I know that Councilor McKenna and Councilor Janino, when this conversation began a couple of weeks ago, it was to get something on the books, because there was really nothing on the books that addressed, nothing specifically on the books that addressed sump pump and runoff. There was some indirect reference to it. There was language in the existing ordinances that made it certainly within the reading of that ordinance that it could address these situations, but it was clear that to make something more direct and more specific, we were better off.
Good. And regarding time-wise after a storm, you know, I think 24 hours is a reasonable amount to give people time to do it, because if something happens in the middle of the night at midnight, and you give someone 3 hours to clean it, there's nobody around in 3 hours. So I think, given that cycle of a day, you know, daytime, nighttime, back to daytime again, would be reasonable to do something. And, but then we have the issue of enforcement. Okay, now ISD is going to go crazy, having to go out and check all these things, because everything that they had planned, whatever is on their books, they have to put aside and go out and do snow removal work. So we may have to put more people on there, at least even during the wintertime. Even during the winter, I'm not saying all the time.
Not my call.
But we know, we've already requested it, Councilor McKenna, put it in already, that we get someone for weekends for inspectional, for building material and stuff. But we have to start somewhere. Listen, the mayor wants to keep the budget down as much as possible. If there are things that we want to see, we will put them in, and we'll put the money in for it. All you have to do is put it up to us, and I'm sure if it's reasonable, this body will accept it. And I feel comfortable with something like that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Council Novoselsky. Council President Janino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first start by thanking my colleague, Councilor McKenna, who put a lot of time and effort into working on some of the amendments on this ordinance in conjunction with Bob Mara. But I think that there are a lot of good things in this ordinance. I think that it's a great way to hold absentee landlords and other situations that we have to deal with accountable for issues that we struggle with in the city. Like anything, there are going to be kinks that we'll need to work out, and there are going to be houses that have, the abnormalities that it may not fit perfectly to the ordinance, but we have to figure out a way to fix the problem. The goal of this is not to hurt homeowners that are trying to do the right thing and trying to move their stormwater and anything the proper way. Like Councilor McKenna mentioned, I think it's good that we do warnings and things like that. The goal of it is to get people that are habitual offenders, that know they have a problem, that are blatantly ignoring it, and that it's causing a problem for their neighbors and for people traversing their neighborhoods. So I think that it's a good start. As anything, we can always amend it as we go, but I think it's a good starting point, and I look forward to hopefully voting on it tonight.
Thank you, Council President. Councilor Granasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the snow removal, you have the snow angels, and so the enforcers will be called the snow devils. So we have a distinction between the two. Well, getting back to the discharge from the sump pumps, it's great for us to come forward and mandate that we put it out in the public way like we did, and relieve the infiltration of water in our sewer system. But now we also have to be realistic to the fact there are some neighbors that can't put it anywhere else but out in the street. And for those neighbors and for those others that need to see this warranted, the city should allow for the homeowner, in conjunction with the city, to dig under the ground and make provisions for that type of service to provide an orderly fashion so that ice dams don't build up and dangerous situations don't occur. But I just think we have to make provisions for that also. And I applaud my two lady councilors, a wonderful job to bringing this forward, because we need some recognition of the problem that we have. And I think Councilor Novoselsky's suggestion about 24 hours is really a fair way to approach it, because you need to have a little time to organize to get somebody to help remove the snow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the leadway. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. So on Councilor Novoselsky's idea about the roof drains, that's a separate issue. We're going to have to deal with that separately.
Well, the section 353, I think it is, 353 refers to the discharge of liquid from properties.
Okay.
And that discharge can come from a sump pump, from a runoff, and all of those terms are defined within the ordinance.
Okay. I think what we're going to have to do, though, realistically, is work with the homeowners, with the engineer, and try to come up with a solution for some of these people, because some of these things have existed for years, and there's, it's going to take somebody with some knowledge in order to solve it. But they are legitimate problems. They're really creating more than just a sump pump problem. These are serious problems when they're coming,
Right, and remember, all the ordinance tries to do is not to abate the origin of the problem. It might suggest that if there's an opportunity to redirect, but the ordinance is intended primarily to give some enforcement mechanism can't abate the problem, or the source of the problem, at least take remedial
Right.
measures to the consequences of that.
And we may have to come back and address some of these items that are on here, but I think, as the council president said, it's a good start. And I commend everybody that worked on this, because we need to do something to move forward here. So
Mr.
I'll take a
Chairman?
committee vote, and then we'll...
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just a question,
ahead.
Bob. This piece that we have in front of us, have your thoughts and potential changes?
Right, I've worked with the councilors on
So
it.
this is good. The only thing we're really changing is the hours.
Yeah,
the
and
timeframe.
there was one typo in section 1204353B. I don't know if that made it to the final. It did? Okay, then there, it's,
So anything that says 3 hours should be changed to 24. Is that,
We already know that.
is that right?
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll take a vote of the committee, and then we'll send it to the council. We're running into the Ways and Means Committee meeting time frame here, so let's get this going. Thank you.
On the amended version of the ordinance relative to snow, slush, and ice on sidewalks, Councilor McKenna?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Morbido is absent. Councilor Patch?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Powers is absent, and Chairman Zambudo?
Yes.
Yes, the amended ordinance will be forwarded to the full city council for consideration.
That concludes the Legislative Affairs Committee meeting. Thank you all for your attendance.